if you want. On top of your screen, in the right corner, you find the icon to manage your screen view. With speaker view, you will only see the speaker at that moment and his presentation. It is also good to stay till the end because Maya will then reveal our speaker for next month. And I now pass the word to Janet, who will present you Robert Hirschler.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning to you all. Great to have you here from around the world and from nearby also. Thank you, Robert, for sharing your knowledge with us. And I would like, before we start and give Robert the platform, I would like to introduce Robert Hirschler to you all. At the last symposium of ICA-Belgium in 2019, we had the pleasure of having Robert as one of the keynote speakers. Before that, I had the good fortune of meeting and listening to Robert's interesting subjects on several symposia around the world. Robert has been actively involved in all aspects of color theory, color science, and color technology since 1966, both in Hungary and in Brazil. He actively participated in the establishment of the first two color measurement laboratories in Hungary in the 1970s and the principal color measurement laboratory in Brazil in the 1990s. Between 1988 and 2011, he was involved in establishing new textile engineering, color measurement, and color design courses, and doing research in the field of applied color imagery. Since 2009, he has been the chair of the study group on color education of the International Color Association, the AIC. Robert is active in teaching color measurement and also color theory for non-scientists. For me, Robert is, beside a very pleasant person, someone who is able to share the science of color in a way that is understandable for all. He is very approachable and always willing to answer any questions of mine and others on color. For 2020, ICA-Belgium planned a few workshops which Robert kindly agreed to give. Unfortunately, this could not be organized due to COVID. Therefore, we are very grateful that he is with us this morning, and I would like to turn over to Hungary and give you the stage, Robert.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, everybody all over the world. It's a real pleasure that you joined us on this, well, at least in Hungary, a beautiful sunny Sunday. And today we shall have a color talk on color theory and neo-impressionist painting. And I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So, why this topic? Well, the neo-impressionists are supposed to be the most theoretically based art movement of art history, and we shall see how far it is true or not. And it all started in 1886 with three young gentlemen who were in their 20s, and their older friend, Camille Pissarro, was 56 at that time. And the leader of the group was Georges Seurat, who had been studying and reading some color theory and was trying to put it into practice. And he was followed by Paul Signac, Lucien Pissarro, and of course Camille Pissarro. This Impressionist exhibition, and this was called an Impressionist exhibition, not Neo-Impressionist at that point, started off rather hectically, because Pissarro wanted these gentlemen to present their latest work, which was something revolutionary, and other people didn't like it. They didn't like it so much that Renoir, Sisley, Monet, and Caillebotte simply decided not to exhibit on this exhibition. They withdrew from the exhibition because they didn't like what the others were doing there. And of course, the art critics were not very kind to these new paintings. The work of these painters, Pissarro and Seurat are the most notorious, are interesting only as exercises of highly mannered virtuosos. The paintings are lifeless, for the painters here neglected sincerity, seduced as they are by external formulas. And so it went on. They were bashed, people didn't understand this whole thing. And some years later, Gauguin even said that this is good for little tiny green men who are piling up little dots. Which is not a very kind way of putting their art. But there was one art critic, Félix Fénéon, who understood that this is something new, something interesting, something worth noticing. And he mentioned that for their part, they divide tones in a deliberate and scientific way. This development dates from 1884, 85, 86. Indeed, Seurat started to paint his fabulous, huge painting in 84. But who was Félix Fénéon? Well, this gentleman was an art critic, a full-time anarchist, and this is serious. I mean, he was blowing up bombs, and he was put into prison for some time. So he was very serious also as an anarchist, but as an art critic, he was a great friend of the Neo-Impressionists. And 4 years later, Paul Signac painted his portrait, which he called against the enamel of a background rhythmic with beats and angles, tones and tints. So this is Félix Fénéon, and we shall quote many of his criticisms, because he was the one who tried to understand what's happening here. And what was happening here all started with this magnificent painting. This is a huge canvas. It's 3 by 2 meters. It's hanging now in the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's called A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jatte. And it's very different from everything that had been shown before. It's very different from the works of the Impressionists, who shall be called by a term romantic Impressionists. Others use this term for them, the old Impressionists. Neo-Impressionism and Neo-Impressionist was a term coined by Félix Fénéon, and it referred to this group and then others who joined them, and they were using a new technique. And Fénéon started or tried to explain it. If, for example, in Monsieur Seurat's Grand Jatte, one examines a square decimeter covered with a uniform color, within each of the centimeters of the surface concerned, you will find all the elements that make up that color in a swirling mess of tiny maculae. Well, let's see this little square decimeter on the painting. Still quoting Fénéon. Take this patch of lawn in the shade. The majority of the strokes establish the local tone of the grass, but the local tone is what we would call the real color. This is the color of the object as illuminated by normal daylight without interference. This is the local tone. Other orange strokes are scattered to give barely noticeable action of sunlight, illumination. Others in purple introduce the complementary of the green. Wow, this is colored shadows. The scattering of cyan blue provoked by the proximity of a stretch of sunlit grass intensifies near the demarcation line and progressively diminishes further away from it. Complementary because of simultaneous contrast, which we shall discuss later. So these are important concepts, and these make a neo-impressionist, or later you shall call it a divisionist painting. Of course, if we now take another detail of the same painting, then instead of the tiny dots, we see dashes, which was very characteristic later of Signac's paintings. And Signac himself, in a study which he published in 1899, with the title From Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, and this was a manifesto of neo-impressionists. He explained what they were doing, and he said the neo-impressionist doesn't paint with dots, he divides. So that is a difference because many people think that neo-impressionism is pointillism. So let's talk a little bit of the terminology. So neo-impressionism is a term applied to a movement itself. The movement that flourished in the 20 years from 86 to 1906, but which had an effect on many of the later artists. Into the late 20th and early 21st century even. Bridget Riley, who is a famous op art artist, claims that she was influenced by the neo-impressionists. So beyond these years, they had a great effect. Divisionism is a term invented by Signac to describe the separation of color into dots or patches applied directly to the canvas. So instead of mixing paint on the palette, they were putting paint side by side on the canvas. Seurat himself rather liked to call it chromoluminarism. He didn't like the term pointillism. But many people use pointillism for this technique, which is the technique of using tiny dots. It may be divisionism, it may not be. And divisionism may be pointillism, or it may not be. So the three terms are definitely not interchangeable. And Signac, in his pamphlet, explains the benefits of the new impressionist technique and the gist of the new technique. First and foremost, the optical mixture of uniquely pure pigments, all hues of the prism and all their tones. All hues of the prism, these are the spectral colors. So they were using very, very bright colors. They didn't like to use earth colors. The separation of diverse elements. This is what Finion was describing already after seeing the Grand Jatte. Local color, color of lighting, their reactions, interactions, and so on. The balance and proportion of these elements in accordance with the laws of contrast, gradation, and irradiation. And finally, the choice of a brushstroke which fits the size of the painting, which is very important because, as we shall see, the whole effect of divisionist painting is brought about by getting nearer to the painting and seeing something different from when you step back a few steps and watch it from a distance of a few feet or a few meters. And we shall see why this is so exciting and why is it so unique. Now, we have to go back a little bit, more than 50 years, because the neo-impressionists always claimed that they trace their roots back to Delacroix. Delacroix, who was considered a great colorist and who was a master of colors, and Signac in his study explains how Delacroix already used complementary colors next to each other, green and the red, and simultaneous contrast of the red and the blue, and the orange and the green, and so on. He explains the whole painting. But he also recognized that Delacroix's painting, despite his efforts and his science, are less luminous and less colorful than those of painters who followed his steps. And Signac himself says that if you put Delacroix, for instance, the entrance of the Crusaders, between Renoir's boating party and Seurat's circus, it would look rather somber, rather dull, rather sad. Now, this is an interesting question, and unfortunately, we have a very short time, so we can't go into many details, but the neo-impressionists didn't really know Delacroix. They knew some of his paintings and knew some writings about Delacroix. But Delacroix's diary was published many years later. So Signac, Seurat, and the group didn't know firsthand the thoughts of Delacroix. But they liked to refer back to him because it gave them something to refer to, some status that they are the followers of Delacroix, who was well respected by that time. Where did they get the science from? Well, in 1839, this gentleman, Monsieur Chevreuil, who was a director of the famous Gobelin works in Paris, doing tapestry, and he was leading chemist of the times. And he was called there because they had problems with some of the yarns. And the customers were complaining that the colors were not right. And he started to investigate and discovered that it was not chemistry that was a problem, not the dyes which were problematic, but it was the interaction of colors. And he published a book, 700 pages, on the law of simultaneous contrast of colors. And this book had been quoted many, many times and had been referred to many, many times. And the two effects that he was very interested in were simultaneous contrast and complementary colors. Complementary colors evoked by successive contrast. Simultaneous contrast, of course, everybody knows. If you place the same color, that's in this case a gray, on a light background, it will look darker, and on a dark background, it will look lighter. And if you stare at a color, then after some seconds, you will start seeing around it the complementary colors. And if you stare at it for 20 seconds or 25 seconds and look at a neutral surface, you will see the complementary colors evoked. Now, in 1861, a young Scottish physicist, James Clerk Maxwell, introduced the word color photography. And this was based on additive color mixing. There was no colored film then. So he took 3 photos, through a red, green, and blue filter and projected them so that the red, green, and blue images were in register and were mixed on the screen. This is true additive mixing. We add the three colors, the three stimuli together. Maxwell also played with something which was new that time, a spinning disk. Today we call it a Maxwell disk, which is a disk which can rotate very fast. And if you look at it while it's rotating, then the colors will be fused in our eyes. And this is what we today call additive averaging mixing, because what we see is the average of these three stimuli. Is the average of the chromaticity and the average of the brightness of these stimuli. And our friends, the neo-impressionists, learned all this through this gentleman, Charles Blanc, who published his Grammar of the Art of Design, Architecture, Sculpture, and Painting in 1867. We are still nearly 20 years from the advent of neo-impressionism. And the neo-impressionists knew Chevreuil through Charles Blanc. And this is important in Charles Blanc because this is something which made, in the first place, Seurat very curious. He said that if we have two colors, let's say a red and a green, put side by side, the two colors will reciprocally hasten each other. This is Chevreuil's simultaneous contrast. But also, if we make very fine strips of the red and green paper or panel and put them side by side so that we cannot see separately the two colors, they mix in our eye, red and green, mingling with and destroying each other by this apparent mixture, optical mixture. The second panel will appear gray and colorless. Now this is interesting because he already said, he was the first to use mélange optique, optical mixture, the term. But he didn't say that optical mixture will be brighter or more colorful than the components. Very much to the contrary, he said that they will appear gray and colorless. Helmholtz was a physicist and physician and an expert in the psychology of perception. And in his book, also in the same year, 1867, he made the big difference between the mixture of paints and pigments and the mixture of lights. And this is important. This was known. Today we say that the mixture of lights is additive because if we add a blue light to a red light on the screen, the result will be a lighter and brighter magenta. And the same way, blue and green will give cyan and red and green will give yellow. And the three together, if well selected, will give white. And it was Helmholtz who pointed out that this is very different from the mixing of paints, because this is the opposite. And then we have cyan and magenta giving blue, which is darker and duller than the two mother colors. And cyan and yellow will give green, and yellow and magenta will give red, and the three together will give black, and so on. So this is important that paint mixing and color mixing are very different. And the last source, which we shall mention today, is Ogden Rood, an American physicist who was also an amateur painter. And he published Modern Chromatics in the US in 1879, and 2 years later, in 1881, it was published already in French. And Rood was speaking about pigment mixtures and light mixtures. And he was speaking very much about optical mixing, complementary colors, and he knew very well what was happening. But unfortunately, we know that Seurat had a copy of Rood's contrast diagram. He was showing complementary pigments of his time. Complementary in the sense that in their mixture they would give something very neutral, a gray or a dark gray or maybe a black. But there is one part of his book which was grossly misunderstood. He said, "We refer to the custom of placing a quantity of small dots of two colors very near each other and allowing them to be blended by the eye placed at the proper distance. The results obtained in this way are true mixtures of colored light. This method is almost the only practical one at the disposal of the artist, whereby he can actually mix not pigments, but masses of colored light." Here are the dots, placing them side by side. But this is a misunderstanding and this is a misinterpretation, because people today say that this will give a very light and very bright effect. Well, it doesn't, because what happens if we place, in this case, additive complementaries side by side, they will enhance each other in the sense of Chevreul's simultaneous contrast. Blue and green, cyan and red, blue and yellow, cyan and red, green and magenta. But if we look at it from a distance, then the mixture of blue and green will not be white. The light mixture, the true light mixture of blue, I keep saying green, it's yellow. Blue and yellow, the mixture of blue and yellow is white. But this mixture, the optical mixture, is not white, it's gray. This is how it would be if it were true additive mixing, but it's not. And the same with the other color pairs. Now, this is an example from the textile industry. If you mix fibers, very, very fine fibers, cyan and yellow fibers, if you mix them in what is called in the textile industry carding on a card, this is an intimate blend of fine fibers. If you mix them as fibers and spin them, you will get green, an optical mixture. But if you spin the yarn first and place them side by side, then you can distinguish the two colors, and this will be simultaneous contrast. So this is optical mixture, this is simultaneous contrast of the very same two colored yarns or fibers. And this Signac already knew very well. Complementary colors, which are friends and enhance each other when contrasted, are enemies that destroy each other when mixed, even optically. And look at Seurat's painting, The Circus. This was Unfortunately, his last painting, he died when he was 31. This was the last painting, which is a fascinating painting, a beautiful painting. And this is a detail from here. But if you look at the painting from a distance, it has a kind of grayish mist. So this is the big contradiction. People very often say that the neo-impressionists wanted to make optical mixture to make their paintings brighter and more vibrant. Well, they were using this technique, which gave the paintings a scintillating effect and a very interesting interaction between viewer and painting. You move closer and you see vibration. You move away and you see the colors blending. So this is a dynamism which hadn't been seen before. But this is not to say that this is the same thing as mixing two colored lights. Signac again. The red surface and the green surface contrasted, stimulate each other, but red dots, this is red dots with green dots form a gray, colorless mess. Well, the same story again. The painting, by the way, is Reiselberger's Scarlet Ribbon. Now, Reiselberger was a friend of the neo-impressionist, the French neo-impressionist. He himself became a neo-impressionist. He was one of the founding members of the Belgian Leuven group, and they invited later Signac and Seurat. So there was a very close cooperation between the Belgian group and the French. And you will see Reiselberger in another context very soon. Well, a few words about neo-impressionist facture, the brushstroke. Well, impressionist brushstroke and neo-impressionist brushstroke is very, very different. They both used very pure, very vivid colors, mostly straight from the tube. But the way they put it on the canvas was very different. And the neo-impressionist brushstroke is not one definite thing. Signac's Boulevard de Clichy. This is an interesting painting from the beginning of the neo-impressionist movement. This is very early neo-impressionist. Now, if we look at the painting, there are parts, the swirling snowflakes, which is still impressionist, classical romantic impressionist. And the details here and here are neo-impressionist, divisionist. This is the impressionist part of the painting with the impressionist brushstrokes. And this is already divisionism in the sense that we are using it for this technique. Now, interestingly, the brushstrokes can change not only within one painting, but also along the career of one painter. Let's take again Reiselberger. His painting from 1889, Seascape, typical divisionist painting. Detail, typical divisionist, even pointillist brushstrokes. 10 years later, Boulogne-sur-Mer, still by Reiselberger. Different brushstrokes, very much like Signac's dashes. So he changed his style. And then a mere 6 years later, Gale from the East. And if you look at the details, this is beyond divisionism. This is beyond neo-impressionism. This is pointing to something new. And mark the year, 1905. This is the beginning of something which later we shall call Fauvism. A very interesting question. Can you use a divisionist technique with watercolors? Of course, this is a different technique, so it's problematic. But in 1888, Pissarro recommended his friend Signac. Watercolor for you, I recommend watercolor for you because it's a valuable tool and practical. In the space of several minutes, you can successfully note things down which would otherwise be impossible. So Pissarro here is recommending to Signac to use watercolor for the studies, which he can do in a very short time. And then later he can use his divisionist technique in the paintings. Well, Signac 4 years later answered his friend, and he said, that won't do. Why? It's not good at all. It will take ages before I'll be able to make any use of it. May 1892, a letter to Pissarro. And yet a few months later, he made a study of a later painting, Women at the Well. And he used watercolor and ink. He made the study in watercolor, and then he made the painting with the well-known divisionist technique, oil on canvas. But he got so hooked on making watercolor that in later years, he became a very prolific watercolorist. He was traveling around the world and making aquarelles, watercolors, and not as studies of something, but as final paintings. Of course, he wouldn't deny himself. If you look at the brush strokes, they are the dynamic divisionist touches, but it's not a divisionist painting. Others also use this technique. Cross, Henry Edmund Cross, who was again a friend of the group, he joined a little bit later. He became very friendly with Signac. By the way, Cross's original name was Delacroix. No relation. I'm sorry, should have. So his father was Delacroix, his mother was English, and he didn't want to be mistaken for the famous Delacroix of the mid-19th century, so he changed his name to Cross. And he again used watercolor for a study and then made the final painting in the divisionist technique on canvas with oil. Now, this is an interesting story by the same Henry Edmund Cross. Bullfight, typical neo-impressionist divisionist painting. Look at the date, 1891, 1892. And then a year later, he made the watercolor details. For a long time, they thought that these had been studies for bullflight. Now, these are later than the final painting. So he was just experimenting with the technique. Dubois-Pillet, who was one of the first to join the group, used watercolor in a divisionist manner as a final artwork, not as a study. And Petit-Jean, Hippolyte Petit-Jean also made a great number of watercolors, which today are very valuable paintings in their own right, not just studies. Well, what can we conclude? One art critic said, in the sense of physics, in the sense of Ogden-Rood's claim, let me remind you here that Ogden-Rood's misunderstood and misinterpreted claim, pointillism has failed as an attempt at an additive mixture with pigments, but achieved other significant effects. The hypothesis of science was thus empirically refuted by painting, but brought to painting an increase in creative means. As I mentioned earlier, many modern painters learned a lot from Seurat, Signac, and company. Bridget Riley, whom I quoted already, said she copied one of Seurat's paintings in the pointillist manner. And she said it was the best masterclass she could ever have taken. She learned so much from just copying one of Seurat's paintings. So let's conclude and finish again with Felix Finion. Monsieur Zay, whoever he be, can read treatises on optics for all eternity, but he will never make the Grand Jet. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. It was very, very interesting. Even if you know something of art science, art history, I mean, this is really revealing what you have told, I think. Because yeah, we always were thinking about that claim about mixing of light, which you show isn't right. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think there were a few questions for you. Let's see.
Oh.
Well, there was a question about where to find the books you mentioned. Are they available online or somewhere, or in libraries?
The old books, the 19th century books, are available online. Most of them. The Chevreuil is available online in French and in English. Rood is available online in English and the French translation. Helmholtz is available online in German, and if I'm not mistaken, French. Maxwell, you have to do some, there will be, in Canada, there will be a presentation on Maxwell Scholar Science very soon by the Canadian, by our friend Kazim Hilmior. So that's Maxwell. Modern books are not available online, unfortunately. On Chevreuil, there was one book published in the 1980s by Faber Biren, with annotations and explanations. And he published Ogdenrood's book, Modern Chromatics, also with annotations. And just last year, there appeared a new book on Chevreuil, but I've just started to read it, and I don't have good feelings about it. But there is plenty of literature on everything that I have said. But you have to collect the bits and pieces from dozens of books and publications.
Robert, can I just shortly ask a question? Would this, you also like this book of Harold Altkin a lot? There's also a piece of Neo-Impressionist he
Yes.
writes about. Maybe if people want to find out more, this would be a good starting point.
Well, this is definitely one of the best books on the market on not only on Neo-Impressionism, but on color in general. It's called Color in the Visual World by Harold Altkin. And the new edition is just coming out. And hopefully it will be also available in electronic format. Another valuable source is David Brick's website, which I quoted when I showed the difference between divisionist and, between simultaneous contrast and optical mixing. And David Brick's website is a wealth of information. I mean, it's really, really rich. You can go as deep as you want in color theory and color science on his website. So this is a very good resource.
Okay. There was another question from Anna Maria Di Cara, if I pronounce it well. It's a long question, but I will read it for you. Do you think that the evolution from classical realism to impressionist abstraction that scientists of the 19th century, Maxwell, Chevreuil et al., together with a new way of seeing and observation employed by the neo-impressionists, led to a new understanding of what may be considered to be an innate need of humans to be surrounded by the harmony of color and light in complementary color and light relationship in order to experience visual, physical, and emotional comfort?
Well, this is a very deep and philosophical question. You know, I think that there is always an interaction between the spirit of the times and the art of the times. Also, there are big debates about how much Impressionism, the appearance of Impressionism, is due to, well, paints in tube, in tin tubes, were invented in 1841. And some people claim that just because paints were available in tube made it possible for Impressionists to go out in the open air, plein air painting. So this gave an impetus. Well, other people deny this and say, no, they could go around with big bladder holders of paints, and they could do plein air painting also without it. So it is all very, very, everything. I think that everything that relates to art is always questionable, always debatable, and there are opinions. In the case of the Neo-Impressionists, it's remarkable how much they were left-wing anarchists, many of them. Fenion I mentioned, but the others also were radical left-wing. What did it have to do with their art? We shall never know. certainly it does influence. You know, the times you live in, well, we see it along the ages, that the times you are living in influence the way, but it's not always one person. It's somehow it's coming. And then there are a number of people. That's why you have these art movements. Because the time was ripe for Impressionism, and then from Neo-Impressionism, and then for Fauvism and German Expressionism, and so on and so forth. They influence each other, they are building on each other, they are influenced by the world around you and by what's happening in the world. And we shall yet see how COVID-19 will influence the art which is to appear now.
Yeah, my question is it true that we always want to find this harmony for us, for our well-being within these complementary colors? If we see, for instance, a red, do we need that cyan to have a harmonic feeling? Is it really so? Or
I think that all rules of harmony are very artificial and very forced. Harmony is such an individual experience that what I find harmonious, you may find revolting. If I find complementary colors harmonious, you may find them exciting or upsetting. So I would hesitate to give any rules. We know a lot of things about what's happening when you look at two colors or more colors. We know since Chevreuil, we know how colors influence each other. But what emotions it would evoke in you, that's a different story. You know, so I cannot say that complementary colors are harmonious. No, we know that they act on each other. We know that they enhance each other's effect. We know that if you mix, this is, by the way, the definition of complementary colors. If you mix two complementary colors, they will give you, depending on the situation, a neutral color, white or gray or black. And that's the most you can say.
all right, thank you. I think, yeah, that's it. Lots of people are thanking you, Robert, for your very nice speech and presentation. You can read them in the chat messages. I give the word now to Janet to.
No, it's Maya. Maya,
Maya, sorry.
is going to, yeah, no problem, no problem. Yeah, Robert, it was really inspiring. Thank you so much. I heard it before, but it was even more impressive this time. So thank you very much. I think we had a great learning experience here. Maya, could you maybe tell for next month?
Okay, I will just shortly announce. Thank you. So I'm really glad we can announce our next color talk that will take place on the 23rd of May, same time, 10 o'clock Brussels time. Our next speaker will be Liz West. I have just sent you in a chat a link. Hopefully you can see it. Oh, yes, it's there. So Liz West is a British artist who works with color and light, creating very interesting installations, sculptures and environments that play with our perception and experience of color. So we will be posting more details on our website very soon. In the chat, you can see her website if you're interested in advance to take a look who she is. So we are very excited to have her. We will we hope, of course, you will join us, and looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maya. I stop recording now.